Welcome everybody to the April meeting of the CLF Rocky Mountain Hub, where Jay is going to be enlightening us today. So I appreciate you joining, and hopefully you're going to be able to enjoy some of this great weather that we have. The agenda today is pretty simple. I'm just going to flip through a few slides here. Jay's going to talk about biogenic materials and carbon, and then we'll have some Q&A discussion with the time that we have left. So yeah, so first, just welcome from the co-chairs. Victoria, Matt, and I are volunteering to lead this group and organize these webinars, and helping educate our community and stakeholders in addressing embodied carbon to lower those impacts in buildings. And so I've listed our affiliations and emails there if you ever want to contact us. I see Matt's on the call, and I think Victoria is not going to be able to join us today, but welcome. And just as a really brief reminder, the Carbon Leadership Forum is an industry academic collaboration hosted at the University of Washington, and they have various hubs around not only the country, but around the world as well. And so the Rocky Mountain region is one of those hubs. If you go to carbonleadershipforum.org, there's a ton of resources. There's lots of webinars and reports and materials and toolkits. So if you haven't been on the website, it's a great resource, and I do recommend it. If you're not already part of the community, you can create a CLF community account and join the Rocky Mountain Hub community, and we do occasionally send emails out that way, but also you can get emails from the broader CLF community as well. So you can get like a daily or a weekly digest of different emails that people are sending around, and learn about different resources and helpful tips and things like that. So again, this is a nice resource. And then at the bottom of the slide, I have a link to the sign up for the Hub mailing list. It's actually the same link that I sent out in the email invite earlier today. So you don't have to memorize that string of letters and numbers there. You can just go back to the email and click that if you're not already on the list. All right, and without further ado, I'll introduce Jay. So today we're going to talk about bio-based materials and how we should be accounting for those, the sequestration and release of the carbon in biogenic materials, and really importantly, as the demand for biogenic materials increases, how are we going to meet that demand? So Jay's a teaching assistant professor at CU Boulder, teaches a mixture of architectural studios and engineering courses with a focus on sustainability. He has a PhD in architectural engineering from CU Boulder, and his current research focuses on embodied carbon life cycle assessment, building stock modeling, and industrial ecology. He's a co-chair of the Structural Engineering Institute Sustainability Committee, and previously was a research fellow with Project Drawdown and visiting researcher at Edinburgh Napier University. So welcome, Jay. We're really pleased to have you here and excited to hear what you have to say. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and you can take over the screen whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks, Jim. There we go. Yeah, good to be here and good to share with this is a topic that I know there's a lot of interest in around the embodied carbon spheres, and so I'm happy to turn this into a bit of a discussion at the end. Let me get everyone's faces in the right spot. Turn this into a discussion at the end. But I want to be sharing with you a bit of the research that I've been working on over the past 4 or 5 years or so. Some of it's coming from my PhD, and then some of it's coming from some more recent stuff. So yeah, buildings and biogenic carbon. How should we account for it? And is there enough out there for us to be building with, taking a macro scale globally? It's a bit of an outline of what I'm going to be going over. I know, or I'm assuming everyone's quite familiar with embodied carbon, so I'm going to breeze through some of the typical beginning stuff that I talk about, just of climate change and buildings. Then I'll get into specifically carbon storing construction materials and the 2 classes of materials that how we can classify them. I'll look at how currently we're accounting for biogenic carbon, So what are the different accounting methods out there? I'll give a little bit of perspective, I'll say, on where I perceive the need going, but I won't make it fully academic, and we'll bring it back to what the practitioner needs, and then wrap up with putting all this into context of the supply and demand balance between bio-based materials, and how much might we demand, how much might we have. So first, I'll get into buildings and climate change. So I was a research fellow with a nonprofit organization, Project Drawdown, as Jim just mentioned. And Project Drawdown is a group of researchers that got together and put this project together to say, hey, currently today, do we have enough solutions, or do the solutions that currently exist out there, are they good enough to get to this moment of drawdown, the point at which we are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And so our current trajectory going up, and then the moment of drawdown is when we begin to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the parts per million doesn't keep increasing, but instead goes down. And the question was, do we have the current solutions out there? And the answer was yes, we have the ability to do this. We have the technology available and the solutions available to reduce the carbon, the sources of emissions, as well as then augment the sinks of carbon, be it in our ecosystem solutions with land use and within our oceans. And so I like sharing this framework because I like the solution-based approach that Project Drawdown has taken. Instead of framing the climate crisis, climate emergency, whatever you want to call it, as doom and gloom of, oh, there's all these problems associated with it, let's instead focus on the solutions. And where bio-based materials come in here is they can be part of the solution if used appropriately. And I'll come back to this when I wrap up, of where I see bio-based materials fitting into this whole context of moving our society towards this moment of drawdown. So we all know buildings contribute 40% of greenhouse gases, 30% from the operation, 10 to 11%, depending on who you ask, from the manufacturing. So us as building designers, we're responsible for a large piece of that pie. And so when we look at whole life carbon, so everything with our initial construction, what we refer to as our embodied carbon, typical operation, our operational carbon, we might have some retrofit and refurbishment, we lump that all into the embodied carbon. When we look at the cumulative of all this, of the typical construction, as we get towards net zero energy building, or net zero carbon buildings, this green line continues to flatten. We're getting very good at that, and we've been making some good reductions in getting our embodied carbon down. All of us here, we're working on that. And then this dashed line at the top would be then our whole life carbon. So the framework that I've been working around is, okay, we're using bio-based materials. Is it possible to instead of having the initial emissions be positive in the greenhouse gas balance of the inventory there, could it be negative, and I'll put that in quotes, are we actually able to store carbon in our construction materials enough that even when we are operating our building and getting to that near zero carbon efficiencies, that the balance of a building over time might be one in which our buildings are part of the solution, in which we are storing carbon in our buildings, and so identifying the opportunities for the built environment to become this carbon sink. And so this is the idea of what would need to happen for us to get our buildings to be net stores of carbon and be regenerative within their architecture. So might sound a little bit far out in terms of, is that feasible? But let's take a look at the materials that might allow us to get there. So I want to talk now a bit about carbon storing construction materials. So before I get into carbon storing construction materials, I want to take a moment to just be clear about some terminology. So I've heard over the years, carbon sequestration and carbon storage be used interchangeably in terms of talking about buildings and construction materials, but I want to be very precise with their meanings. Carbon sequestration is the active process of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turning it into something else. So a great example of a carbon sequestration mechanism would be photosynthesis, where we are turning CO2 with water to make our cellulose byproduct then of oxygen. In contrast, carbon storage is the long-term storage of that carbon or short-term storage of that carbon. So a construction material, the 2x4 that we pick up at Home Depot, that material didn't do any carbon sequestration. Our buildings aren't sequestering carbon in the context of bio-based materials. Rather, our buildings are storing carbon. It's a temporary thing on geological timescales because at the end of life, something is going to happen to that piece of wood or that piece of bio-based material. So that's sort of that differentiation between carbon sequestration and carbon storage. And I bring this terminology up because it's very important for us to recognize that they're two separate things, and being precise in those words when we're thinking about the lifespan of a building that has construction materials is essential. So another carbon sequestration mechanism is that of carbonation. This occurs in cementitious materials where calcium hydroxide or calcium silicate hydrates react with CO2 in order to form calcium carbonate. I'm not going to talk too much about concrete carbonation. Happy to dig into that another time if folks would like, around carbon storage or carbon sequestration and carbon storage of cementitious materials. So what then is, what types of materials are bio-based and can are derived from things that have sequestered carbon and that are subsequently stored within them. So I've just selected a smattering of materials. This isn't a comprehensive list, but we have dimensional lumber, engineered wood products, bamboo. These are all structural materials that we can use that store carbon. We've got concrete down there and dashed lines to indicate that it's sequestering carbon through that carbonation mechanism. And then we have our insulation materials, if we want to look at, depending on how you want to consider cellulose insulation, any other vegetal concretes like hempcrete, and then straw as insulation materials. So these are other materials that are derived from bio-based products. When we look at the fluxes of greenhouse gases, I'm just showing not global warming potential in terms of a midpoint indicator, but really just looking at what are the emissions in terms of the CO2 that's emitted versus sequestered for each of these materials. This is for a kilogram of material. So note that we can't be comparing materials across here as we're not on a functional unit basis. But the emissions of nearly all of these materials, the orange bars up top, has the potential to be significantly offset by the sequestration. These materials uptake more carbon or carbon dioxide and when they grow than that are emitted in their construction. Granted, I'm only looking at A1 to A3 here in terms of our life cycle stages. So I show this so that you can see there's a tremendous opportunity here. If we can be using materials that have that negative balance between the uptake versus their emissions and their manufacturing, we have the potential to realize that point, that framework that I brought up earlier of our buildings being a carbon sink and then a part of a solution. So what is the timing of these emissions? When do these occur? Since that's really important when we start talking about the accounting of them and how we want to deal with that, since that's the crux of the matter here, and probably most of you all joined today. So here's those two carbon sequestration mechanisms plotted over time. Let's take a look at the photosynthesis one, since that's the primary thing that I want to be talking through. But we're going to have some initial emissions with the planting of our tree if we're going to be growing it, and taking a backwards looking approach, which I'll get more into in a second. But then over time, that tree is going to grow, that photosynthesis is going to be occurring, and we're going to be sequestering carbon into that tree or straw, whatever it might be. So the time scale of this is variable. Then when we extract that raw material, when our A1 phase really comes to an end, we have that extraction, the harvesting. Now we're going to be adding greenhouse gases to it. That we are using diesel, we're in energy, we're contributing emissions there. Then through the production and construction, we're going to continue to increase on that. We'll have minimal contributions in the use stage of our building. And then at the end of life, there's a huge range of options that might happen. We might combust our wood and not use it for bioenergy, in which case all of that CO2 that was just sequestered was stored for a bit and then was emitted right back out. Or we might send it to a landfill, recycle it, so on and so forth. I'm not going to spend too much time on end of life. We can get into that if we'd like, and I'll explain why I don't like to spend too much time on end of life. But what happens there is unknown, and there's a huge variability in that. But that's going to have a huge impact upon the balance of what it is that we're choosing, or what we're trying to do in choosing how to account for this. Carbonation, on the other hand, all that carbonation mechanism happens during the service life of the material, so during the use phase, and then at end of life, we can speed it up a little bit if we increase the surface area. So in short, the timing of emissions is really important. Right here, all I'm looking at is just emissions, not looking at a midpoint indicator, not looking at what the actual climate impact is going to be, but rather just where is CO2 flowing and doing the mass balance around it. So how should we account for biogenic carbon? This is something that there's not an agreed upon way of going about it. So I'll walk through the three primary ways that folks have been looking at accounting for it. So first off is the 0-0 approach. And this is the approach that says, hey, biogenic carbon is really complicated and so nuanced, and really we have no idea what's going to happen at the end of life of our building or of our product. So let's just ignore it. It's the conservative approach. We're not going to take any benefit from temporarily storing this carbon that was sequestered and then stored in a construction material. Let's just ignore it. And this is what some proponents say is the most conservative approach. You go talk to your steel and your concrete folks, they're really going to be up on the 0-0 approach for biogenic carbon, since there's so much uncertainty around it. So it's saying, hey, with the forest system over here, we're not going to consider any interplay between the forest system and the building system or anything beyond life. We're only going to account for, potentially the methane, since that has a different bit of a characterization factor. So don't worry too much about that right there, but we would just ignore all the biogenic carbon. We're only considering it when it gets into methane and in terms of measuring its warming. So this isn't typically what we're seeing used nowadays. That's the conservative approach. And if those of you that are using Tally, that's where you just uncheck the includes biogenic carbon box. But what's typically used nowadays is this -1+1 approach. And the -1+1 is essentially tracking the biogenic carbon throughout the entire life cycle of the forest system, as well as the building system, where we say, all right, there was some CO2 that was sequestered by our forest system into our construction product. That's subsequently stored and passed into our building system. So there's a plus coming out of here, so the flux going across there is 0. When it's coming to our building system, we count it as a negative. And then when it exits our building system, we count for that as a positive. And granted, yeah, we have our other greenhouse gases when we get the different, when we're converting that biogenic carbon into different greenhouse gases that then have different global warming potentials associated with them. And then if we are then passing that again to a subsequent product, we're again now moving that as a negative forward. So this is really tracking and keeping and accounting for the biogenic carbon across all the modules, the entire life cycle. We'll see where this is a little bit limited when we talk about EPDs here in a moment. The third approach, which I see as being the more robust approach, is by using let me go back to the -1+1 before I get there. So one thing about the -1+1 is that there's no time factor occurring anywhere in here. This occurs independent of time. If we were looking at a paper cup that we might get at the water cooler, or if we're looking at a piece of timber that's going to be in an old church that lives for 500 years, well, we treat the biogenic carbon the same. And there's a limitation there of if we're treating that biogenic carbon the same, independent of time, well, that really is independent then of the climate system. And if we're truly worried about the climate system in addressing embodied carbon and what the climate impact of our decisions are, well, then we need to consider its interaction with the climate. And so that's where the dynamic approach comes in, is it takes into account the temporal nature of the uptake and of the release of the biogenic carbon. So in this way, we have a time-based approach where we are growing a tree and we are looking at the interaction of that tree with the atmosphere at any given point in time. And so the uptake and the release of it as that tree grows. So the tree's going to grow, sequester a good amount of carbon. Then we're going to see, all right, let's track that again, similar to the -1 + 1 when it enters our building system. We're going to potentially store that carbon or that biogenic carbon in our building system for 60 years, let's say. And then we're going to track the release of it, depending upon if it's released as methane, carbon monoxide, or carbon dioxide, depending upon whatever end of life scenario that we want to choose. So the key thing to recognize around this dynamic dynamic approach for accounting for biogenic carbon, also referred to as a dynamic life cycle assessment or dynamic LCA, is it's much more complex. We have to understand what's happening in the climate at the same time that we understand what's happening in our forest system as well as our building system. And so we're integrating the climate, building, and forest systems all together in order to account for it. And so it is a little bit more complex. And one of the primary nuances and points of debate is, well, when should we account for the growing of our forest system? If we're going to be using a piece of timber, say today, when was that tree planted? Well, if we're on a 70-year rotation period, such as common in North America, well, that tree was planted in 1952. So if we're going to start doing our carbon accounting and understanding the impact on the climate of that, well, we need to start our accounting back now in 1952. And then bring it for the 70 years that we grew that tree. And then today, all right, we're making a decision about what's going to happen today with that tree, and then look 60 years forward, and then we're going to have an end of life. And so the temporal dynamics of this is a little bit more difficult to take into account. And what were the decision makers making when they planted that tree back in 1952? Did they see the shift in mass timber happening? Were they concerned about the climate crisis and all that? Probably not when that tree was planted. And so that gets into the chicken and egg causality dilemma, essentially, of this, of when do we say that the biogenic carbon that we are using and storing in our construction materials truly is having a benefit to the climate. So in a backwards looking approach, that's what I just said, where we had the initial emissions of the planting, we grew that tree over time, and then construction starts, and then we're going to track our pulses of emissions going forward around that. And that's a backwards looking approach where we start our carbon accounting when we planted that tree. In contrast, a forwards looking approach says, well, we didn't really know what that tree was going to be used for. Me as the building designer, I might be contributing, like that tree, as it's sitting right now in the forest, well, it's continuing to grow somewhat. It's continuing to sequester some carbon. There's other ecosystem benefits that are happening. I can't say, if I'm just taking that tree and moving it into, and I say tree, it can be really any bio-based material. If I take that tree and just move it into my building, I like to just say, all right, if I walk outside right now, cut down a branch of a tree and put it on my coffee table in my building, can I truly take a benefit for that? Not necessarily. We can't say that just moving that carbon from outside to inside of our building is just a shift in the carbon pool. We're just moving it from one pool of carbon to another pool of carbon. It's not doing anything good for the atmosphere or for the system. Instead, the forward-looking approach considers, all right, well, I'm going to wait until I regrow that branch or regrow that tree in order to then take the carbon benefit for it. So it's a more conservative approach for that. And penalizes you initially for cutting down that tree, and then you're able to recover that over time. So this is what we see in a forward-looking approach. And both approaches are valid. There's arguments to be made for both of them, but typically backwards-looking approaches are more appropriate when your timber is being harvested from forests that have been planted in an afforestation effort, whereas a forward-looking approach is more appropriate when timber is harvested from existing forests that are currently there. We can think of, even if it's new growth, people still advocate for the forward-looking approach, and then we're subsequently replanting them. And so a lot of the academic literature around this really says that a forward-looking approach is the more conservative thing to do for buildings and is the more appropriate one to do. So starting to account for that biogenic carbon regrowth between time 0 and then whenever the rotation period of that will be. So the dynamic approach, as I just described, it's a bit more complicated. And so that's why most accounting methods and the typical LCA practitioner or architect or engineer is not going to be wanting to get too into the nuances of this, since you have to understand a little bit of the climate effects. And it's not just as easy as multiplying embodied carbon coefficient by the mass of material. It takes a little bit more. So so we can come back to dynamic LCA, and I'll come back to it here in a little bit. So what do the different standards available to us today say? Well, the PAS 2050 method, it takes the -1+1 approach, where we have put a characterization factor of -1 kilogram of CO2 for every kilogram of CO2e for every kilogram of CO2 that's sequestered. So that's where we get that -1.83 kilograms of CO2, and the sequestration per kilogram of material based upon a 0.5 kilogram of carbon per kilogram of material carbon content. They then say, all right, in module B, you get to take a temporary carbon storage benefit, and there's a function for that. But if you're storing that carbon for longer than 100 years, then you're able to consider that carbon as permanently stored. Even if in year 101, you just burn it and put it right back in the atmosphere. This method, or this accounting method, allows you to take a full carbon storage benefit for it. And then in module C, it's just using our typical characterization factors for a kilogram of CO2, as well as then, or 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalent for emitting 1 kilogram of CO2, and then 25 kilograms of CO2e for emitting a kilogram of methane, just our typical IPCC characterization factors. And I won't get into land use change, but there is some stuff done around direct land use change, but nothing around indirect land use change. So this is what's commonly implemented by most folks around biogenic carbon. I'd say it's one of the more prominent accounting methods that's been adopted. Similarly, the ILCD, the International Life Cycle Data Systems, they follow this -1+1 approach with then a temporary carbon storage benefit given depending upon how long you've stored it for. And I think if you're over 25 years, someone might correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a plateau that you get to after 25 years. So that's some standards, but what's done actually in practice? So what is done in our environmental product declaration, or our EPDs? And so typically our EPDs are taking a -1+1 approach. Well, they're saying, yep, there is some biogenic carbon here, but we're taking that -1+1. And this is limited though, as EPDs are typically only cradle to gate, especially our industry average wood EPDs. We can take a look at those too if we'd like. Yeah, so that's just, I pulled this from the industry average one where, yeah, we're just looking at cradle to gate A1 to A3 for those EPDs. So if we're taking that -1+1, well, only the -1's occurring in the A1 to A3. So how are they dealing with that +1? And so that +1 and taking a biogenic carbon credit through this one ISO standard. And so there's an ISO standard that says if you have a sustainably managed forest, and that might mean if you have a certified wood product, if you're FSC or even SFI certified, you get to say that you have a sustainably managed forest. I'll leave the debate as around these two different certification methods for another time. But if you know that your wood's coming from a certified forest, you get to take the biogenic carbon credit. Or if nationally for the forests, all the forests in the US, we have stable or increasing forest stocks. What that means is nationally, if our forests are increasing and we are using harvested wood products in our buildings, we get to take a full benefit of that biogenic carbon. Even if on my specific forest where I am building, I am deforesting it and just clear cutting everything. I could still take this within my EPD and say that I am doing good around it and take a biogenic carbon credit, even though I'm contributing to deforestation, because nationally we're doing a good job. So you can see why this is a little bit limited in what's being done in EPDs. And so if you're able to take a credit, so if you're coming from a sustainably managed forest through one of these two options, then you get to say, all right, when biogenic carbon enters your system, you get a characterization factor of -1. And then when it's leaving the system, you say it's then +1. So you're just essentially implementing that -1+1 approach. So this is what's done in our EPDs. And if you go read through the nuances of the AWC EPDs for softwood lumber or the engineered wood products ones, you'll see that there's some addition that happens with the end of life stage that gets pulled into module 8.3 there. Okay. So that's what's done in our EPDs around this. And this -1+1 then also follows us through our different LCA tools. So if we think of, look at Athena, and we look at what the end of life assumptions are of how are they dealing with that. They take that -1 on the, they don't put it in the module A, they put it in module D, but how are they doing that full accounting for that biogenic carbon? Well, they're assuming that 80% of any wood product goes to a landfill, 10% to recycling, and then 10% to incineration. Some of that landfill goes into aerobic and anaerobic digestion, depending, and so you get different emissions factors on that when you go look at your life cycle inventory. And then there's the assumption that 87% of it, of the wood that goes to landfill is permanently stored, and 13% decomposes. So what this means is that even if we take a construction or a harvested wood product, we cut down a tree, put it in our building, and then stick it in a landfill, it means that nearly 70% or 69.6% of the original carbon that was stored in that wood is assumed to be permanently stored in the landfill. So having permanent storage, and only 30% of that carbon is then released back into the atmosphere as different greenhouse gases. So the conversion, depending upon the landfill, into our methanes, our carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxides. So this is what Athena does in saying that, all right, 70% of the carbon that's sequestered by a harvested wood product stays that way. Tally does something similarly, except it has different numbers of assuming what happens at end of life, where 15% is recycled, 64% in the landfill, and then 22% incineration. And then assuming that 50% of it decomposes in the landfill, and then 50% is permanently stored. And so this is where now you get that 32% of the original wood, or by mass that was put into your harvested wood product, is then permanently stored. That carbon is permanently stored in the landfill. And so this is what is done in Tally. And if we look at an example of how this all works for Tally, and I'll just skip to the results here. What they have is that if we're excluding biogenic carbon in it, even when we take the benefits beyond life in that module D, we're still getting a positive value if we're excluding biogenic carbon, but when we include it, we get a negative value, showing that, all right, over the entire lifespan, more carbon is sequestered and stored in that construction material, even at the end of life, than was emitted in its manufacturing. So this is how the tools that we are using as building designers are treating biogenic carbon, really on that -1+1 approach. So the -1+1 approach I find to be quite limiting in the fact that most of our climate goals all revolve around 2050. We have to have a net zero built environment by 2040 it is. I think I have that number right. By 2040, if we're going to meet that 1.5 degrees Celsius. I don't have the current IPCC report numbers around that. That's really what's being asked. And when we think of regrowing a forest, when we specify a piece of lumber, that's going to take 70 years from now. So we're pushing 2090, assuming our climate or the trees are able to grow the same as in the new climate as in the past climate. As well as then the building we designed for 60 years, maybe we're hoping for 100 years with it. Well, that end of life isn't going to occur until 21, 22 in terms of that timing of emissions. And so when we start thinking about wood as a solution to the climate crisis and saying, oh, buildings, we should really be building with wood because it's going to offset all of our embodied carbon. I do my -1+1 accounting. Look, I get this number out of Tally that says, when I include biogenic carbon, I'm getting a negative value. Well, not really if we're taking a forward-looking approach. We can't take that credit until we've emitted it already. Until we've regrown it, because we've just cut down that tree and it was providing a lot of other ecosystem benefits, and we can't take that credit until we regrow it. So as you're building truly net zero carbon, if say you got your zero energy and you're doing really good on your biogenic carbon side. And I'd argue that no, you can't take that benefit until well after this. And when we actually look at the climate dynamics of it, we're not doing as well as we could be. So I'll illustrate this with a different metric than global warming potential, but that is with global temperature change. And so this is taking a look at what is the temperature change globally, so the global temperature change associated with the extraction and manufacturing and then subsequent regrowth of 1 kilogram of all of those different materials that we looked at on that first graph. So our dimensional lumber, so our sawnwood, our glulam, say a CLT, cork, if we want to get into some insulation materials from Europe, and then some faster growing materials. So bamboo, hemp, and straw. So those are in the dashed lines there. And what we see with this when we're using a forward-looking accounting approach for this, and this is a dynamic life cycle assessment, or the results of it, but not using kilograms of CO2e as a metric, but global temperature change. What we see is that for the benefit to be realized of cooling the atmosphere by using timber-based products, we're not able to realize that benefit until a substantial amount of that tree has been regrown. And that's not going to happen until 2038, if we're looking here for our sawnwood and our CLT. And then for a glulam, that's going to be pushing to closer to 2045, closer to 2050. And that's well past when we said we were needing to be net zero fully. And so there's some question marks about, all right, you can't really say you're getting this negative until much later in the life cycle. In contrast, though, if we use materials that are shorter in rotation time, so fast growing materials such as bamboo, which has a 7 to 10 year rotation period, meaning we can grow that much quicker. Hemp and straw, which have an annual rotation period. Well, we see that cooling benefit on the climate is near immediate. And because there's such few emissions with the manufacturing of these, because they're very bio-based, we see substantial cooling. We're looking at 1 degree, I guess, it's 1 to 10 to the negative 15th, but when we multiply it by the whole surface area of the globe, we get something a little bit different when we actually look at normalizing things. But the cooling benefit that you're able to get is much larger for these fast-growing materials, and that cooling benefit is immediate. And so when we start going back to my original question of, hey, can we treat the building stock as a climate solution in a place that we are storing carbon? Well, using fast-growing materials can, but if we're using slower growing materials, not so much. So wood is not going to be the solution to offsetting all of our embodied carbon. We can't just take that -1 credit when we look at the actual, and then say, well, we'll take that +1 later on in life, or later on in module C, when we're trying to really address our embodied carbon. Wood can't just offset everything. And so you might be saying, Jay, how can I go learn about dynamic LCA? That seems way too complex for me. I have to bill out my 38, 39, 40 hours on my client projects. I'm not going to have time to go do this. Give me a easier metric to understand all this through. And there are some that exist out there. So a hybrid type metrics that take into account the rotation period of whatever crop you're using, as well as then the rotation period of the crop, as well as in the storage period. So this is again now plotting our different materials with the rotation period below each one. So 90 years for sawnwood, 40 years for glulam, and then our annual crops here. And then comparing the emissions in blue. So this is the fossil fuel emissions within the storage credit that you get. And so we see for 2 different time periods. So orange representing 30 years and then green representing 60 years. And so what we see for the sawnwood is that when there's emissions associated with our kiln drying and all that. And so that's a positive. But if we only store that sawnwood for 30 years and then we burn it as bioenergy and take the credit from that, we're actually doing having a negative impact on the climate. We're contributing to deforestation. And so that's being approximated through this metric here. Whereas if we get to 60 years, then we're able to say that, okay, we actually did a little bit of good here, where we would scale our biogenic carbon by that minus value. So that's something to recognize, is that even if you're using wood, it's not always going to get you that negative value. So I'll conclude now with taking a look at some of the supply demand balance and asking the question, do we have enough trees out there? So forget these fast growing bio-based materials that I was just talking about. Do we even have enough timber out there to build all of our buildings that we might need to build? And the answer is no. from a rough calculation, so not getting into the super nitty gritty of all the forest models and all that, but just from a rough calculation and using some fairly conservative numbers, we do not have enough supply of timber to meet the potential demand at a global level. In fact, we have 36% of the supply in contrast to the potential demand. If we switched everything over to mass timber buildings, so we converted our whole building stock, starting today, going to 2050, well, we don't have enough timber for that. We're on an order of magnitude where, it's 36%. So there are some scenarios that we might construct or some policy decisions that we might get where, yeah, we can make sure that we do have sustainable management of our forestry supply. But the thing that I want you to take away here is that globally, we don't have enough. In the US, on the other hand, we probably do if we count Canada in here, as we have some pretty strong forests, except we also are going to build a lot of new floor space over the next 30 years. And so when we zoom in just on the US and Canada, there are some questions about that of will it truly be sustainable or not. On the other hand, though, if we look at the fast-growing bio-based materials, so just looking here at bamboo and straw, and we look at what the potential demand is going to be versus the potential supply over that same period of 2020 to 2050, well, we see that in almost every single region of the world, we have enough timber. We have enough bio-based materials. We see that the magnitude of the supply is greater than the magnitude of the demand. So the supply is in the blue bars here, and then the supply is in the blue bars here, and then the demand is in the green. And so we see in pretty much every region, the supply exceeds the demand. And so what this shows, and also around this, it's showing that in the places around the world where we need new construction, so primarily in the global south, where we can grow a lot of bamboo as a structural material, we can match that up, which is great. And then in the global north, where we have a really good existing building stock that just needs to be retrofitted from a thermal insulation perspective, that we have straw, which we can use as an insulation material there. And so that's something to consider, not necessarily from the structural engineering side, but from our envelope side is, well, can we use straw-based, compressed straw insulation? And be incorporating that into our buildings, because not only do we have enough of it from a supply perspective, but we also have, but it also has a more immediate cooling benefit. So there's one thing that you take away from me talking today, is that biogenic carbon's tricky. It requires a nuanced accounting approach, and that there's limitations to the -1+1. Those are the takeaways I want you to have from me talking. So conceptually, I've put this together. This is primarily, just a good conceptual representation of all this. When we zoom back out to okay, what am I going to do for my project? Well, if we have a net zero energy building that we're designing, it's nearly net zero carbon. There's going to be that initial pulse of our embodied carbon. But as we regrow with, say, different materials, if we regrow with straw, we're going to get an immediate cooling effect. If we build with bamboo, we're going to get a little bit less of that, but it's still going to occur fairly quickly. If we're using short rotation timber, yeah, we're going to get there too, but it's going to take a little bit longer. And if we're using long rotation timber, it's going to take much, much longer. So those are the key things the key takeaways to have from my talk. And then, yes, at the end of life, many things might happen around that. And I personally, or my perspective on end of life right now, is we should not fuss too much about end of life when we're performing a life cycle assessment of a building today. We should not fuss too much about the end of life of our building. Instead, we should take all the energy that we might put into fussing about the end of life and put that energy into figuring out how to make our buildings last longer. Because extending the lifespan of our buildings is going to have much more of an effect than worrying about what's going to potentially happen at the end of life 60 years from now. If we look 60 years back, I think we'd be aghast at what we currently have in terms of technology. And so really spending too much time around end of life, well, yeah, it's important and we need it for doing LCAs for LEED and whatnot. Yes, I get that, but don't worry. I wouldn't worry too much about it and focus more so on extending the lifespan of your buildings. So yeah, so that's what I have for you. So thank you for your attention and listening. I'd love to open up for discussion this last 15 minutes. and talk through any questions that you have or discuss anything that I covered.
Awesome, Jay. Thank you. That was really interesting. Looking at the chat, I see Michaela says great talk. But if anyone has any questions, just unmute yourself, ask it through the video, or if for some reason you can't, you can always type it in the chat. But yeah, let's hear it.
Hello, my name is Bailey. I have a question. I'm just curious. Do you think taking that dynamic accounting approach would improve the accuracy of EPDs in terms of that biogenic carbon?
Yes, but the issue with the dynamic approach is you need a lot more information. And so that's where using it more for, it's not quite mature enough as an analysis method. The framework that we have with EPDs right now doesn't really support using dynamic LCA, because dynamic LCA is very specific to the product that you're using, the forest that you're using, and then where it goes. And so I don't see a way for that to fully work. And so instead, I think the development of more hybrid metrics to include in it and saying, okay, if you're going to store this carbon in your building for 20 years, for 40 years, for 60 years, this is the coefficient, this is now the modifier that you should have for that biogenic carbon. The development of those would be more appropriate. And they exist for different forests. And so that's what I would push for inclusion in EPDs rather than going for the full dynamic accounting. But if for a whole building LCA, yeah, you could go more with the dynamic, especially when you're including operational carbon in there.
So a follow-up question quick, for that change to occur, that would imply that an update to ISO 21930 would have to happen, right?
Yeah, and for that to happen, we're talking years in terms of that standard.
Interesting. Well, thank you.
Hi, Jay. Great talk. One question I have, and you may not have the answer, but I've read that when a tree is harvested, only about 20% of the material makes its way into long-lived products, and the rest goes into short-lived paper and otherwise is burnt or otherwise. And I wonder if, you know, do these EPDs and these carbon balances, do they account for that rest of the tree that goes into these short-lived products? Or is that supposed to be accounted for in those specific products?
So that'll be accounted for in those specific products. And so all the biogenic carbon that I was just talking about is only what actually enters into your building. And so that's where the forestry dynamics get more complex around it, and I don't have that expertise. And so that's accounted for separately. So our EPDs, at least in North America, I'm not sure about elsewhere, that's all they're taking account is their product specific. Yeah. Others that know more about that, feel free to chime in, since I'm not an expert on our EPDs.
Hi, my name is Patrick with HGA. You seem to imply then that something like a CLT is probably a fairly good choice, given that it's using the shorter lived, you know, getting into your temporal discussion that you had. Still not a great choice. There are things like hempcrete, but from my understanding, hempcrete isn't a terribly great structural product. So I don't feel like I'm any further ahead really, except with the understanding of the temporal, which I knew about, but I didn't really understand. Do you have a suggestion on how to zero in on that?
Yeah, so my suggestion is use wood where wood is good. So to your point on CLT, yeah, fast growing CLT, excellent. If we can get a 40-year, I think there's one Quebec EPD that has a 40-year rotation period on it. That sourcing from that's going to get you're doing your dynamic LCA, that's going to be a better solution when we actually look at the climate impacts of it. Hempcrete, yeah, insulation material. The name hempcrete is such a misnomer. It's not a replacement for concrete. Hemp lime composites is what I tell my students is to call it, so that way they don't get confused. And so that's using CLT and using mass timber, yeah, it still has a better impact even when we do a dynamic LCA compared to steel or compared to concrete. So it still performs better. I'm happy to link you to a study that takes a look at 3 equivalent structural systems for it. The takeaway that I want to have here is that when we talk about carbon storage in buildings, and we talk about buildings as a carbon sink or as a climate solution, insert any buzzword around this, that we have to be careful about what accounting methods we use. And wood is not the answer to that. Rather, fast-growing materials is a better answer to that question. And so what is the answer to the wrong question of that? Or sorry, what is the wrong answer to the question of how do we turn the built environment into a carbon sink? Rather, fast-growing materials is a better answer. So using that in insulation materials, essentially.
Is there anyone using a dynamic accounting right now? We started out using Tally and we're slowly switching to one click. It just seems a better product. But both of those, of course, are, as you're saying, using the +1 -1. So
yeah, that's something that I only know academics are using dynamic LCA, and it's my mission in the next 5 years to figure out a way to get it out to practitioners. So
we'll keep our eyes open.
Yeah, not sure how best to do that. So maybe it'll be a good conversation to have in the coming years.
I have a question. So Alexis Vitale with KLNA. Do you, with those like short-term rotation products, so like straw, bamboo, and yeah, I guess those two really,
Yeah.
are you aware of those kind of entering the market in any structural capacity, or just aware of anyone kind of looking into that? I mean, I know bamboo's used worldwide structurally, but not so much in North America.
Yeah, I had a conversation with somebody who was trying to get that structural CLT bamboo in North America. So they're growing some bamboo in Alabama. I think they're still shipping all the way up to Pacific Northwest for manufacturing, which didn't quite make sense to me, but there you go. So I know that there are products in development. I mean, there's huge market opportunity for that. But then I guess on the residential side, Eco Cocoon would be one product that is doing the compressed straw insulation, but nothing. So not a great answer for the structural side around it.
Is that like a SIPS product?
No, they're wood framed, and then yes, it's similar to a SIPS, but not, yes, similar to a SIPS in terms of modular construction, but not a SIP.
So just to be clear, there's no EPDs out there right now that use like the forward-looking approach, or do you know of any like published LCAs out there that illustrate that really well? Or
Will Hawkins, let me see if I can get the link to it real quick. Oh, it's behind a paywall. So there's one study out there that probably has the best one for a structural system dynamic LCA. I haven't seen any published like more practitioner based LCAs for it. So
okay.
Something that, and I'm not aware of any EPs that are doing that either, since they're primarily following the ISO standard for it.
Okay, great.
Hey Jay, it's Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
At Earth. Okay, I appreciate that you kind of talk about just the complexity of this whole matter. It just seems like it gets more and more complex every time I try to think about it. So can you kind of give like a little bit of 101 to the group here, and especially, you know, since I'm asking like about carbon sequestration and storage of materials, like looking at your graph with say straw, you know, having the greatest storage credit, like what is actually happening there?
Yes.
And sorry if I'm kind of lowering the caliber, the call.
No. I always forget my audience, so thanks for bringing it back. Yeah. So this one that you're referring to?
That one or the one I think after it.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So just like the mechanics, right? Like how is straw actually doing that carbon sequestration in the building.
Yep. So the straw, we grow the straw
Yeah.
during that uptake. So I guess let's go back to like this one.
Sorry, I was late a little bit.
No, all good. So we grow there's a little bit of emissions from the planting of the straw. We grow that straw very quickly.
Mhm.
And the carbon balance of the greenhouse gas balance, or the ratio between the emissions and the sequestration of straw, is much more in the sequestration favor. So there's significant amounts of carbon uptaken in comparison to the emissions there.
Mhm.
And so what is being shown here is essentially saying, all right, so we sequestered all that carbon with a rotation period of 1 year.
Mhm.
So all that carbon came in, and we now have, and it takes 1 year to regrow all that. Because if we had just left that straw out there, well, that grass would be living. It's a little bit of a different conversation for perennials, or sorry, for short-lived crops versus trees.
Mhm.
But the crux of this is it takes 1 year to grow that back.
Mhm.
And so we get that full credit back immediately. So even if we took that straw, put it in our building for 2 years, and then just burned it,
Yeah.
we're still having a little bit of a net benefit because we took carbon out of the atmosphere for a little bit amount of time before putting it back in.
I see.
And so we're getting a little bit of delayed credit there. Whereas if we now store it for a long period of time, we're getting much more. And we could add, and this is just for one product here. And so that's where it's a compounding effect for if we started looking at one piece of land. And if we want to take one piece of land or one unit of land and grow fast growing stuff on it, well, the carbon balance of that is going to be pretty, the balance of it just as that piece of land is going to be pretty stable. And we're essentially using photosynthesis as that carbon sequestration mechanism to pull, think of as a factory, just pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and pumping out construction products. And so that's how then the straw gets the benefit is increased for those faster growing ones.
Okay. And it's assuming that it's being consumed or taken down every year and kind of being.
This is just doing it once. And so it'd be even more if we did it for more years.
Acre,
yep.
Yeah. Okay.
And know that, we can't really be comparing between these materials because they're not functionally equivalent, right? So they're just 1 kilogram of material.
Yeah, that would be a good point to make, right? Like how much yeah. Again, it's so complex, right? So thank goodness there's people like you that understand it better.
Yeah, and it's trying to figure out how to get, because currently there's not a good metric out there to make it simple. And that's something that we're working on to figure out how do we get some more simple metrics out there for inclusion.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.